Hello, everyone. This is Mark Manganello with the Bureau of School Finance with the Department of Education. This is an Adequacy Fiscal Year 26 Adequacy training. On the screen here, we have a spreadsheet. Um, uh, I always keep the filters on because some people might not be familiar with Excel, but these filters allow you to select towns. If you do want to get rid of the filters, you can always click here, and if you click filters, it goes away. But we like to have the filters here so you can drill down to your particular community if you're not Ackworth. So it makes it a little bit easier. This training, a couple learning objectives. We're going to learn the different components of state funding through the adequacy formula. Another key thing that we'll start right off the bat with is knowing the difference between a swept grant and an adequacy grant. The combined total is your state funding, but it's important that you know where the swept money comes from and how you receive it as a school district. It's a state property tax that is collected locally. And then adequacy grant is state cash, so it comes from the state treasury, from the state's bank account to your school district. So important to know that. Um, some of you might see your state funding growing or decreasing, and you're going to want to be able to identify what, if you are curious, you might want to identify what's causing that. Usually, if you have declining enrollment, that's going to be the cause. If you have declining free and reduced price meal population, essentially population measuring poverty, you could have less money coming in. There's also a lot of other reasons. The other one is the hold harmless grant is phasing out. So if your community receives a hold harmless grant, that could be the cause for why you have less funding in fiscal year 26 relative to fiscal year 25. And then lastly, a common question is people wondering if adequacy is restricted to particular students like special education students or students on free and reduced price meal waivers. Applications, those that is not restricted. Adequacy is unrestricted, so it comes into your school district and you can spend it on any educational purpose, not like some of the federal grants that are restricted to a particular cohort of students. So we're just going to go through the adequacy spreadsheet. So the first thing you'll see is adequacy is a level of towns. So adequacy is calculated at the municipal level. So although Ackworth is part of the Fall Mountain School District, we calculate it at the municipal level. So Ackworth will have their own adequacy calculation. Ultimately, Fall Mountain, the school district, will receive the funding, but we calculate adequacy at the municipal level. So you'll see towns, and then you'll see something called ADMR. This is ADM. So what we're doing when we determine the adequacy for Ackworth, we are looking at all of the students who reside in Ackworth and are attending a Fall Mountain funded education. So there's 90.2 students who reside in Ackworth and are the responsibility of Fall Mountain to provide an education. So this would not include home education students. This would not include non-public students. This would not include EFA students. This would not include charter school students. It's just the students that are district public school students. So what we're doing is we're measuring something called ADM. Once we've determined the student lives in Ackworth, they're receiving a district funded education. And what an ADM is essentially it looks at the full school year. So this is looking at the full school year 24-25 school year. And essentially why there are decimals is because sometimes a student is a fraction. So for example, Fall Mountain has a 180 day calendar, and the student spent 90 days in Allenstown, then 90 days over 180, that's 0.5. And then 90 days over 180 in Ackworth, that's 0.5. So they would not be a full ADM. They would not be a full average daily membership and residence at this particular community. They would be 90 over 180. So that would be 0.5. So when we do these calculations, there are fractions because some students are not staying within their district or within their home or within their moving in the middle of the school year. So we capture that via fractions. So we are looking at all the students who reside in Ackworth under the responsibility of Fall Mountain School District, and we're calculating their ADM. Something to point out is if it's not about where the student gets educated, it's where the student lives and the school district that's responsible. So there's no schools in Albany, New Hampshire. They send their students over to the Conway School District. And so since they send the students elsewhere, they still have to provide that education. They have to fund it. They have to pay tuition to send their students to another school district. And so we're going to give Albany the adequacy funding so it can pay its tuition bills to another school district. So a common thing that people switch up is it's not about where the student is educated, it's about who's paying for the education, which is the taxpayers of Albany, the taxpayers of Ackworth. So we're calculating the ADMRs and we're coming up with a number. So if they're attended the full school year, it's 1 ADM. And then if they were partially through the year, it's a fraction of that 1 ADM. And so we're tallying that all up and we're going to times it by $4,265.64. And we call this base adequacy aid. So this number goes up by 2% each year. So if we look at fiscal year 24, it was 4,100. So then we gave it a boost of 2%. And it became up to 4,182. And then in fiscal year 25, it's $4,265.64. So base adequacy is going up by 2% each year under state law. And we're timesing those number of ADMs times that rate, and we get a number. And so this is going to be the base adequacy funding for Albany. It's going to be $256,000. To $256,898.17 is going to be the exact metric that we're funding base adequacy aid amount. So as you might be able to predict here, if you have more students times this rate, your funding is going to go up. If you have declining enrollment, your funding could go down. Now it's getting a 2% boost each year. So if you have maybe mild enrollment decline, that 2% boost in the rate might keep your funding flat or level. But essentially, if you have declining enrollment, that could be a cause for why you have declining funding with this rate being fixed. That goes up 2% each year. Another thing I'll point out about base adequacy aid is this is the litigation called the Conval case, which there was a recent Supreme Court order that said this number needs to be at a minimum $7,356.01. So that was a Supreme Court order. People have been asking me about when they will receive that money. So what that Supreme Court order said was this is the number that the courts have determined is an adequate education. And then they've asked the legislature to pass a law to be compliant with that order. And so the courts basically sent it to the legislature to operationalize that order. But there's no changes as of August 2025, there's no changes in state law to increase that funding to the $7,356. So if there is a change in state law, of course, you'll be notified of what the funding ramifications might be for your school district. But when you hear the Conval case and you hear base adequacy, we're just talking about this column here, not all the other columns. And there's no changes in current state law to change the funding. This is the law. What I'm describing to you today is current law as of August 2025. So that's base adequacy aid. So we have the base adequacy measurement for each community. Next, we're going to look at the free and reduced price meal metric. So essentially, this is a measurement. It's FNR. We commonly call it FNR. It is a metric for poverty, essentially. So if a student is free or reduced price meal eligible, it means they've provided evidence that they are within 185% of the federal poverty guideline. So their income is below that federal poverty threshold of 185% of the federal poverty guideline standard. So if the student is on TANF or SNAP, which are DHHS entitlement programs targeted for people experiencing poverty, if they are on one of those programs, NHED is aware of that because we have data sharing with DHHS, and so we'll put that student as an FNR student in our database in our system. So we'll make sure that student is counted as FNR, and then that will help you at the district level because you'll now know that student is eligible for FNR automatically. If the student is not on the direct certification list, meaning we've directly certified them as eligible for FNR via the DHHS data files, you as a school district would collect an application. That family would fill out the application, including information about their household and their income. And if it was determined via the application that they were FNR eligible, then you would, on your end of year reporting at the school district, report them to the state as being FNR eligible. And so we'd also get information about students experiencing poverty through that data collection. But once we've looked at the 90 students that live in Ackworth and are the Fall Mountain School District students, we look at of those students, 28 of them we've identified as FNR eligible. So we look at those 28 students as a subset of these 90 students, and we're going to give Ackworth $4,265.64. In addition to that, we are also going to do for each F&R student, the 28 students here, we're going to give them $2,392.92. So that 28 times that rate equals the 69,000. And so just like base adequacy, this rate is also increased by 2% each year. So last year it was 2% less than this. And so it's going to continue to increase 2% each year under state law. So also looking at the demographic, again, looking at these, 60 students who live in Albany and are the responsibility of the Albany School District, we're finding 31 of them are F&R eligible. We also have 16 students who have IEPs and are receiving special education services. And so for each student we identify as receiving special education services, we provide $2,184.84. There was a recent Superior Court order, not the Supreme Court, but a Superior Court order that said this number is not enough or needs to be examined by the legislature. And so we, at this moment in time, no changes in state law, the Department of Justice, no one has advised me to change the funding. So the current law is that this number is $2,184, but you might be familiar with litigation saying this funding is not enough. That litigation is in Superior Court, potentially could be appealed to the Supreme Court. And so the Department of Education, once we get guidance, either from the legislature, from the Department of Justice, we'll go ahead and implement what needs to be implemented. But at this moment in time, the number is $2,184. English language learners, so students who are English language learners. So in Alexandria, we have 1.7 students that are English language learners. That is a federal program that focuses, federally defined program that focuses on providing additional funding for students who have English as a second language. And so if you are one of those students, you get an additional $832.32 in funding. And so we're tallying this all up. I'll pick on Alexandria here. We have 204 students. 74 of those students are F&R, 39 are special education, 1.7 is English language learners. And we're tallying up all these metrics, and this is an ongoing process. Right now we're at 1.139 million. Lastly, what we look at is if the student is home educated, so they are not a district student. They have decided to take the home education pathway, but they want to take coursework at the school. So we will give them 0.15 ADM for each credit they take. So in Alton, we have one student there, but appears to be one student taking one course that is home educated, not an Alton School District student, but they have taken a course there, and so we prorate that course essentially. And so 0.15 times the 4,265 equals $639. So not a lot of students statewide that are home educated but taking a course or multiple courses at their district public school. And so we're doing this process of tallying up all these rates relative to these metrics to get the cost of an adequate education. And so when we do that for Alexandria, we get 1.139 million. And so what basically is happening here is the state has determined this is what is the cost for an opportunity for an adequate education is, that Alexandria needs this funding, this 1.39 million, in order to provide an adequate education under state law. Like I said, a lot of people disagree with that. There's court orders that say that funding is not enough. This is what it is currently in state law. And this is what it will continue to be until we're informed otherwise. So 1.139 is the million is the number. We as the state need to ensure you have that amount of funding. So we do that 1.139, and we need to ensure you have enough funding to pay that. And so the way we do that is first we look at what was your swept amount. And so the swept grant, the statewide education property tax, is a tax rate that looks at all state properties excluding utilities, and it needs to raise $363 million statewide off all of the state property. And so it's about $363 million raised over around $300 billion in property value. And so that turns out to be a rate of about around $1.12 per thousand. So every single property taxpayer pays, besides utilities, pays that rate in their tax bill, and their local tax collector collects it, and their local municipality has the money, and then that municipality has to send that money to their school district. So Alexandria is part of the Newfound School District. So Alexandria, tax collector there, is going to collect $432,000 in with the swept tax, and they're going to send that money to the Newfound School District. And so since we know the Newfound School District has that money, we know that we don't need to pay 1.1 million to Alexandria. We can pay less than that. So we know that if they have the 432K, we only need to pay them in state cash 707,000. So if they have the 707,000 plus the swept, we know they have the 1.1 million necessary. So where this can get confusing is this is your swept grant. Essentially the money you get from your local tax collector. It is state funding because it's a state mandated tax, and so it needs to be reported as such, but it's going to come in with your local taxes as well. So it can get a little confusing for the school districts and tax collectors because that money is collected at the same time local taxes are collected. However, we do know exactly, this is the exact amount that needs to be sent to the school. It needs to be credited as state funding. So we can do that, the delineation or that accounting pretty easily because we know exactly what it is. So at a minimum, Alexandria is going to get that 707,000 in cash. But we're going to keep going and keep looking at the formula to see if any additional funding is there for Alexandria. Before I continue, there are some communities where the swept is greater. So I'll pick on, I believe this is Alton. I'm going to pick on Alton. Alton, their cost of inadequate education is 2.8 million, but their swept is 4.1 million. So what the state policy is that they already have 2.8 million, so they don't need any additional cash from us because they have more than 2.8 million in swept dollars coming in. So they're not going to receive a check from us. This gets into the concept you might have heard of is donor towns. So the policy of the state right now is that Alton gets to keep all $4.1 million of this swept money. When people, so none of it goes to the state, they get to keep all of it. Where some people say, I'm a donor town, they're under current law, under current policy, that's not the case because they get to keep all their money. But you might have heard people talk about donor towns. That would be if this that sort of rationale refers to an old policy within the state where some of the money above a cost of inadequate education, $1.3 million would be the number, used to be remitted to the state. This was over 15 years ago when that occurred. And that's when you might have heard the concept of a town, if they had to remit money to the state, they called themselves donor towns. And there was litigation involving that. Recently, there was litigation under the Rand decision where taxpayers did sue the state and said it was unconstitutional, or they alleged that it was unconstitutional for Alton to keep this funding. There's a lot going on in that Supreme Court order, but essentially what the Supreme Court ordered under the Rand decision is that it was not unconstitutional for Alton to keep this this money above and beyond a cost of inadequate education, which is the 1.3 million. So nothing has changed. We are under status quo. So how it's been operating for the past few years or past 15 years relative to swept communities and excess swept above and beyond the cost of inadequate education, nothing has changed. Well, I can't say nothing has changed because there's other aspects of the Supreme Court order, but that impacts pretty small communities. So it's a policy relative to negative tax rates, but nothing has changed relative to the excess swept going to the state. But there's a lot of litigation involving this. So hopefully just trying to bring you up to speed that nothing has changed relative to excess swept and what some people call donor towns. So for a community like Alton, where their swept is above and beyond the cost of inadequate education, the formula is done for them. There's no additional funding that they're going to receive. So because they're not going to qualify for these additional grant programs. But if we keep going with Alexandria, there's something called the Extraordinary Needs Grant. And so the Extraordinary Needs Grant is hyper-targeted for communities that have low property and high poverty. And so the way we come up with that metric is we look at property, which is equalized valuations, over poverty. And so if your equalized valuation per pupil is greater than 6.866 million, meaning you. So we'll to pick on this community. This is Albany. So Albany, their equalized valuation per pupil is 7 million. So they have $7 million in property value for each student that's FNR eligible. And so for some communities, they have a lot of property value relative to, and this is going to be Alton right here. Alton has $33 million for each FNR student they educate. And some of these communities here, this is 47 million. This is Atkinson. So they have $47 million for each FNR student. So some of these communities have higher amounts. And so if it's above 6.866, you're not targeted. However, if it's below 1.6, you get $11,500 per student. And so I'll find some community that's close to the amount. This is, let's see who's got the most targeted aid here. It's Berlin. So their number, their aid amount is close to the threshold of 1.664 million. They're at 1.7 million. So any community that has an EV over FNR of 1.664 million, they get $11,500 per pupil. No community hits that threshold. Berlin is the closest, and they're at they don't get 11,500. They get something slightly short of that. So they get $11,366 for each FNR pupil under the Extraordinary Needs Grant. So you can see that this number, the higher your EV FRP, closer to the ceiling, the more aid, the less aid per pupil you get. So for example, we'll see a community here. This is they're getting close to the cap. This community is Bradford. Bradford is close to the cap. They're close to not being eligible for the Extraordinary Needs Grant, so they only get $1,000 instead of the full $11,500 per FNR pupil. And so that is their Extraordinary Needs Grant. So Alexandria, kind of somewhat close to the cap. They get $3,126 for each FNR pupil. So they get some targeted aid there. But we have already determined they need the $707,000, plus we add this. We know that their grant is going to be $941K. $941K at the moment. So here is their grant at the moment, $941 in cash. Lastly, we look to the Hold Harmless grant, the last big grant. Your community, what happened with the Hold Harmless grant is it's based on the estimate. The state came up with for your community and funding prior to major changes in the funding formula happening in fiscal year 24. So what we estimated you would receive in fiscal year 24 prior to major changes being made, there was a Hold Harmless grant in place. So what happened in fiscal year 24 is we increased base adequacy aid, we increased this amount, and we increased extraordinary needs grant, and we got rid of stabilization grants. Stabilization grants were a Hold Harmless grant from the Great Recession. So stabilization grants were awarded to communities who had less funding, were going to receive less funding in 2012 than they did in 2011. And so they were held harmless due to those funding changes in 2012. And so if in fiscal year 2024, so we're talking about 12 years later, if the increases in Extraordinary Needs Grant and the increases in base aid, if those positive changes in the formula to increase your funding were not as much as the funding you received in the stabilization grant because the stabilization grant went away, then you were held harmless in fiscal year 24. And so you were held harmless in fiscal year 24 to that number. Then it was actually 104% of the estimate. Then you were held harmless to that grant again in fiscal year 25. But now, starting in fiscal year 26, whatever that grant was in fiscal year 25 to hold you harmless to this fiscal year 24 estimates, that grant is now frozen in time. And it's going to reduce by 20% every 2 years over a 10-year period. So in fiscal year 25, Albany's grant, and Albany has a really large Hold Harmless grant. Albany's grant was $251,000. It was needed. $251,000 was needed to hold them harmless to those pre-fiscal year 24 changes in the funding formula. So they received a hold harmless grant of $251K in fiscal year 25. Now, in fiscal year 26, we're going to reduce it by 20%. So it's 80% of what it was. And so that is the new hold harmless grant. So if you're looking at your community and you're seeing a funding cut, the first place I would probably look is here, is if you are a hold harmless community, meaning the changes in the formula that got rid of stabilization were not as beneficial as the increases in base aid and increase in extraordinary needs grant, then you're likely a hold harmless community. And now the hold harmless community is phasing out over a 10-year period. So you'll receive for fiscal year 27, this is the number you'll also receive. So Albany received 201K in fiscal year 26. They'll receive 201K in fiscal year 27. And then if we go to the future, it's going to reduce by 20% each year. So the number they're going to receive in 28 is going to be 150K. So that number is going to be reducing by around 50K each year, or sorry, every 2 years. So that's something for your community to know, is that your state funding is likely to, under current law, under the state law, it's going to decrease over time because the hold harmless is going to go away. Unless you have either growing poverty or growing enrollment, you're likely going to see less funding in the future. The last part of the grant is based on our every community. When we estimate, we always estimate in November for the next fiscal year. So in November of 2024, we estimated for fiscal year 26. On a statewide perspective, we're only off by about a million or two. So we were pretty accurate on a statewide perspective, but what we estimated for your particular community could have been off, because essentially we tried to forecast where your FNR numbers would be, your free and reduced price meals numbers would be, where your student populations would be, and we were off. And so if we were off in our estimate, you're guaranteed 95% of the adequacy funding that we originally estimated for you. So if we look at, I'll pick on Ackworth here, 430K was the number we estimated that Ackworth would receive. But if we do this math here, this 68K plus this, 391K is the number. So they need 408K to get them up to 95% of this. So if we do 95% of this, we'd get that 408K number. So they need at least 408K. So they need an additional $17,000 in hold harmless to bring them up to the guaranteed 95% estimate. And so we always tell districts, when you're estimating adequacy funding for budget purposes, you want to be conservative and estimate 95% of whatever NHED provides you, because that's guaranteed funding. And some communities come up higher than the estimate, some come out lower, but you're guaranteed at least 95%. And so finishing out the formula, it looks like Alexandria did not get the 95% hold harmless grant, and it can be confusing. We'll call this hold harmless 1, hold harmless 2, but really it's the hold harmless stabilization grant, and this is the 95% hold harmless. But essentially, we're tallying up all of these numbers, and we're getting the total adequacy grant for your school district. So where it's important to understand, again, is where SWEPT happens and where adequacy cash happens. So for Alexandria, they're going to receive $1 million in state cash. So that's money that's going to come from the state bank account. But they're also going to receive this SWEPT money of $432,000. So their total state funding is $1,454,009. However, it's important to know that the adequacy grant and the SWEPT grant are two different components, because it's going to this is cash and this is a state tax collected locally and retained locally. But state policymakers typically look at this number, where school districts are more hyper-focused on this number. But all of the numbers are significant, and you need to understand the different components. So let's peek back at the learning objectives to think if we covered everything. You know that phase out is going to be declining 20% every 2 years. So if you are a hold harmless community, that grant is phasing out. Adequacy funding is unrestricted. You can spend it on any legal educational purpose. It is not restricted to a particular school, a particular cohort of students. Know the reason why you might have declining funding. It's going to typically be either the hold harmless grant or declining enrollment. Also, FNR number is really crucial. As we looked at this, FNR number is used here in determining the $2,392 students aid you receive. It's also used in this formula. So, for example, Berlin, $11,300 for each FNR student. So that those FNR metrics are really crucial. And then know the difference between SWEPT and adequacy grant, and then know what it means both individually and then combined. So I think we covered all the learning objectives, and thank you for listening to this training. Have a great day.